The rusted fire escape door shrieked against its broken frame as Caselli Pablo crashed through the threshold, his breath tearing through his throat in shallow, desperate gasps. The Phantom of Sangdo District, a man who had orchestrated executions with the precision of a surgeon, was finally bleeding out like any common street thug. His vision fractured, turning the cramped room into a kaleidoscope of peeling wallpaper and shadowed corners. He pressed his palm against the ragged hole in his torso, feeling the steady, treacherous rhythm of his life pooling between his fingers, turning his designer suit into a testament of his family's treachery. He expected a closet, a dead end, the cold embrace of linoleum as his brother's hitmen dragged him back to the gutter. Instead, he felt the feather-light touch of small fingers against his blood-stained wrist. Pablo's head snapped up, his survival instincts screaming danger before dissolving into pure disbelief. Before him stood a child barely tall enough to reach his belt. Snow's dark hair fell in uneven waves around a face that carried the strange solemnity of someone who had seen far too much, far too young. She didn't recoil from the serpent tattoos coiling up his neck. She didn't gasp at the crimson spreading across his white shirt like spilled ink. Instead, she looked at him with the quiet, unshakable focus of a guardian angel in a yellow sundress. Snow didn't hesitate. She wedged her tiny shoulder beneath his arm, her frame trembling but unyielding under the weight of a grown man twice her size. With a strength that could only come from a childhood spent surviving rather than living, she guided the collapsing giant toward a narrow metal-framed cot pushed against the water-stained wall. As Pablo crumpled onto the thin mattress, the world tilted. Above him, the ceiling throbbed with the muffled bass of some distant stereo, the pulse of the city that had just devoured him whole. But here, in the suffocating quiet of this forgotten room, the air hung thick with the scent of broken crayons and fabric softener. Snow moved without speaking. She retrieved a chipped glass of water and a faded washcloth, her movements carrying an eerie efficiency that no 6-year-old should possess. She watched him with eyes far too knowing, her finger occasionally rising to her lips as if reminding the very shadows to keep their secret. Pablo's hand instinctively reached for the blade tucked into his waistband, the reflex of a man who had never trusted anyone, not even himself. But his fingers were too weak, his grip too broken. Snow gently pushed his hand away and replaced the cold steel with a pink plastic stethoscope she'd plucked from the floor. In that moment, the man who had made an entire syndicate tremble realized he was no longer a predator. He was a prisoner of the most impossible savior in existence, a little girl who saw a wounded soul where the rest of the world saw only a monster. As the thunder of combat boots echoed somewhere in the stairwell, hunting for his head, the Phantom of Sangdo District closed his eyes and surrendered his fate to the silence of the ghost in the yellow dress. Before we descend into the blood-soaked maze of Pablo's final night, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Now, the real story begins. Pablo's breath steadied into something resembling control, though each inhale still felt like dragging broken glass through his chest. He lay motionless on the cot, his expensive leather shoes hanging off the edge, too large for this child's world. The room swam into focus gradually, like a photograph developing in reverse. Crayon drawings covered nearly every surface, taped to the walls in overlapping layers, pinned to a sagging clothesline with wooden pegs, scattered across the floor in unfinished piles. Stick figures held hands beneath impossible suns. Dogs with 6 legs chased birds with human faces. A castle made entirely of purple spirals stood guard over a green ocean. Snow knelt beside him, her movements deliberate and focused. She had retrieved a plastic tackle box from beneath the cot, the kind fishermen used for lures and hooks. When she opened it, Pablo saw no fishing equipment. Instead, the compartments overflowed with a chaotic pharmacy of childhood remedies. Cartoon band-aids featuring characters he didn't recognize, sheets of holographic stickers depicting stars and unicorns, a half-empty tube of what appeared to be glitter glue, and several markers with their caps chewed into oblivion. She selected a damp washcloth from somewhere he couldn't see and began cleaning the gash above his left eyebrow with the careful precision of a surgeon. Pablo flinched, not from pain, but from the sheer absurdity of it. His hand twitched toward her wrist, some ancient instinct warning him that letting anyone this close was suicide. But his body refused to obey. He was too weak, too empty, too drained of the venom that had kept him alive for 3 decades. "You're bleeding a lot," Snow observed, her voice carrying no fear, no judgment, just fact. She might as well have been commenting on the weather. Pablo tried to speak, but his throat produced only a rough rasp. She didn't seem to expect an answer. Instead, she peeled the backing off a bright yellow Band-Aid covered in cartoon bees and pressed it carefully over the wound. It was comically inadequate. The cut was easily 3 inches long, deep enough that he could feel the throb of exposed nerve endings. The Band-Aid covered maybe half an inch, yet Snow smoothed it down with her thumbs as if she'd just performed a miracle of modern medicine. "The bees are brave," she explained, selecting a second Band-Aid, this one featuring pink butterflies. "They help the flowers. My teacher said so." She applied the butterfly Band-Aid perpendicular to the first, creating a crooked cross that would have made any actual doctor weep. Pablo felt something crack inside his chest that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. When had anyone last touched him with gentleness? When had anyone looked at his face and seen something worth saving? His neck tattoos began where his collar would normally hide them, a deliberate choice from his younger years. The design crawled upward in elaborate detail, a serpent coiled around a dagger, surrounded by cherry blossoms that had long since lost their symbolic innocence. The snake's scales were rendered in such precise detail that they seemed to shift when he moved. Its fangs dripped permanent venom. Behind it, Korean script spelled out the names of the men he'd killed before his 25th birthday. 6 names. 6 lives snuffed out before he'd been old enough to rent a car. Snow noticed them now, her eyes widening slightly, but not with fear, with curiosity. "You have pictures on your neck," she said, tilting her head. Her finger hovered over the serpent's head, not quite touching. "Did you draw them yourself?" Pablo managed a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a cough. "Someone drew them for me, a long time ago." "They're very good," Snow said seriously. "Better than mine." She gestured to the wall behind her, where a stick figure with what appeared to be octopus arms stood next to a dog the size of a house. "I can't make the eyes right. They always look angry even when they're supposed to be happy." The irony nearly broke him. Here he was, covered in permanent monuments to violence and death, being complimented on the artistry by a child who drew with the earnest imperfection of someone who still believed the world was fundamentally good. The serpent on his neck had been inked by a man named Cho, a tattoo artist in Itaewon who specialized in marking criminals. Each scale had taken an hour. The pain had been excruciating. Pablo had worn it like armor ever since. Snow selected a sticker sheet from her box, this one covered in holographic stars that caught the dim light and threw rainbow fractals across the walls. She peeled one off with painstaking care and pressed it directly onto the serpent's head, right between its eyes. "There," she announced with satisfaction. "Now it's a magic snake. Magic snakes protect people instead of biting them." Pablo stared at the ceiling, unable to process what was happening. A silver star now decorated the crown of his most intimidating tattoo, the symbol he'd used to make grown men confess to crimes they hadn't committed. He'd choked a man unconscious once while that serpent pressed against the victim's face. He'd broken fingers and noses and ribs while wearing that ink like a promise of worse things to come. Now it was a magic snake, a protector. Snow continued her work, applying Band-Aids to the smaller cuts on his cheekbone and jaw, each one a different cheerful pattern. A green dinosaur, a red race car, a purple cat with improbable whiskers. She narrated as she worked, explaining the properties of each design as if they held real power. The dinosaurs were strong, the race cars were fast, the cats were sneaky and good at hiding. "You need to hide really well," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The loud men are looking for someone. I heard them in the hallway yesterday. They had guns." She said the word guns the way another child might say vegetables, with distaste but without real comprehension of the danger. Pablo's blood turned to ice water. They'd been here yesterday, searching, asking questions, which meant this building was already compromised, which meant every second he stayed put Snow in more danger. He tried to sit up, but his vision immediately tunneled into darkness at the edges. Snow pushed him back down with surprising strength, her small hand firm against his shoulder. "You have to rest," she insisted. "That's what my mommy always said when I was sick. Rest makes the medicine work better." "Where is your mother?" Pablo managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Snow's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, something old and sad. "She's sleeping. She sleeps a lot now, in the big hospital with the bright lights." The words hit him like another bullet. This child was alone. Completely, terrifyingly alone in a building his brothers were actively hunting. And instead of running, instead of hiding, instead of doing anything rational, she was decorating his face with stickers and telling him about magic snakes. She placed the final Band-Aid, a shimmering silver star, directly over the cut on his chin. Then she sat back on her heels and examined her work with the critical eye of an artist reviewing a completed canvas. "You look better now," she decided. "Less scary, more like someone's dad who fell down." Pablo closed his eyes. Somewhere above them, footsteps creaked across old floorboards. The building settled and groaned. Outside, a siren wailed past, heading toward some other tragedy. And here in this room, covered in cartoon Band-Aids and glitter stars, a man called the Phantom realized he'd just been handed a responsibility more terrifying than any contract killing he'd ever accepted. He had to keep this child alive, whatever it cost, whatever it took. Even if it meant finally becoming the magic snake she'd transformed him into. The knock came exactly 17 minutes later. Pablo knew because he'd been counting his heartbeats, using the rhythm to stay conscious, to keep the darkness from swallowing him completely. Each thud in his chest was a second closer to either survival or discovery. The sound of knuckles against hollow wood cut through the apartment's silence like a blade through silk. 3 knocks, measured, patient, professional. Snow's head snapped toward the door, her fingers freezing mid-reach for another sticker. Pablo watched her face transform in real time, the childish concentration evaporating, replaced by something harder, older, a survival mask that no 6-year-old should know how to wear. She pressed her finger to her lips, that universal gesture of secrecy, then moved to the door with footsteps so light they barely whispered against the floor. Pablo tried to rise, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he no longer had the strength to wield. Snow shot him a look, sharp, commanding, and he froze. In that moment, she wasn't a little girl playing nurse. She was someone who understood that silence meant survival. "Who is it?" Snow's voice carried through the door, high and sweet and perfectly calibrated to sound harmless. "Building maintenance, sweetheart." The voice from the hallway was smooth, warm even, like honey poured over broken glass. Pablo recognized it instantly. Dante Wolf, his brother's right hand. The syndicate's premier cleaner, a man who'd earned his reputation by making problems disappear so thoroughly their families stopped asking questions. "We're checking all the apartments. There's been a gas leak reported, very dangerous. I need to make sure you're safe." Pablo's breath caught in his throat. Wolf was many things, efficient, ruthless, creative in his brutality, but he was never concerned with anyone's safety. The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. Almost. "I don't smell any gas," Snow said, her voice carrying just the right note of childish suspicion. "And my mom said never open the door for strangers." Through the crack beneath the door, Pablo could see the shadow of boots. Expensive boots. The kind Wolf always wore, Italian leather polished to a mirror shine even when he was wading through blood. The shadow shifted slightly, and Pablo knew Wolf was crouching down, making himself smaller, less threatening. It was a technique Pablo himself had taught him years ago. Get low, match their eye level, make them think you're one of them. "Your mom sounds very smart," Wolf said, his tone dripping with false warmth. "Is she home? I'd love to speak with her about the safety check. Maybe she can confirm with the building manager." "She's sleeping. She sleeps during the day because she works at night." Snow delivered the lie without hesitation, her voice steady. Pablo felt something twist in his chest. This child had learned to deceive with the same casual ease most kids learn to tie their shoes. What kind of life had taught her that? A pause. Pablo could almost hear Wolf's mind working, recalculating. Then came the sound of a wallet opening, the whisper of bills being counted. "I understand completely," Wolf continued. "Actually, maybe you can help me with something else. We're looking for a man, tall, dark hair, probably injured, very dangerous. There's a reward for information, 500,001. That's enough to buy a lot of toys, sweetheart, maybe even help with your mom's hospital bills." Pablo's blood turned to ice. Wolf knew about the mother, which meant he'd already done his homework, already canvassed the building, already knew which apartments held potential witnesses and which held potential leverage. The mention of hospital bills wasn't random. It was a scalpel, precise and cruel, designed to cut exactly where it would hurt most. Snow said nothing for a long moment. Pablo watched her shadow against the door, perfectly still. He could see her thinking, weighing options with a calculation that belonged to someone decades older. The silence stretched, became oppressive. Wolf would be getting impatient now, his friendly mask starting to crack at the edges. "I haven't seen anyone," Snow finally said. "Just the usual people. Mrs. Han from upstairs and the mailman and the lady who yells at pigeons." "You're sure?" Wolf's voice had cooled by several degrees, the warmth evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. "Because lying to me would be very unfortunate. For you, for your sleeping mother, for everyone." The threat hung in the air, unsubtle, vicious. Pablo's hand clenched into a fist despite the pain screaming through his body. If Wolf pushed that door open, if he took one step into this room, Pablo would kill him or die trying. There would be no middle ground. His body might be failing, but his hatred burned bright enough to fuel one last act of violence. "I'm not lying," Snow said, and her voice trembled now. But Pablo realized with shock that it was calculated, a strategic deployment of fear designed to make her seem more authentic, more believable. "I just want to do my homework and wait for my mom. Please go away." Another pause. Pablo could hear Wolf's breathing now, steady and controlled. He was considering his options. Force the door. Too much noise. Too many witnesses in the other apartments. Break it down. Same problem. Wait her out. Time wasn't on his side. Every minute Pablo stayed missing was another minute for him to escape the city, to reach his backup contingencies. "If you see this man," Wolf said slowly, "you need to call this number immediately." Paper slid under the door, a business card, probably, or a flyer with contact information. "The reward still stands. 500,001. That's real money, little one. Enough to solve a lot of problems. Think about your mother. Think about what that money could do for her." The boots shifted, stood, began to move away. But they stopped after only 3 steps. "One more thing, sweetheart. What's your name?" Snow hesitated. Pablo's heart hammered against his ribs. Names had power. Names created connections, made people real, made them memorable. If she gave her name, she became a person of interest. Someone to check on. Someone to pressure later. "Snow," she said quietly, and Pablo wanted to scream. But then she added, "Like the weather. That's what the teacher calls me because I'm always cold." A lie wrapped in truth. She'd given him a name but deflected ownership of it, made it seem like a nickname rather than an identity. Pablo felt a surge of something that might have been pride if he'd had any right to feel such a thing for a child he'd known for less than an hour. "Well, snow like the weather," Wolf said, and Pablo could hear the smile in his voice, sharp and predatory. "You stay safe. And remember 500,001. That's not greed, sweetheart. That's survival. In this world, loyalty is expensive. Cash is simple, think about it." The boots moved away then, their sound fading down the hallway like a receding tide. But Pablo knew better than to relax. Wolf would be back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but he would be back. He'd marked this door, marked this child, added her to his mental list of loose ends that needed tying. Snow stayed frozen by the door until the stairwell door banged shut somewhere in the distance. Only then did she turn back to Pablo, her face pale but composed. She picked up the business card Wolf had slid under the door, studied it for a moment, then walked to her small desk and tucked it inside a drawer filled with broken crayons. "The money man is lying," she said simply, returning to her position beside the cot. "Money doesn't solve problems. My mom had money once. It just made different problems." Pablo stared at her, this impossible creature who'd somehow learned in 6 short years what had taken him 3 decades of violence to understand. Wolf represented everything the syndicate had become: cold calculation, transactional relationships, loyalty measured in currency rather than blood. He would betray anyone for the right price, kill anyone for the right paycheck. He'd probably been counting the money while making promises to Pablo's face, planning the betrayal before the words left his mouth. And here was a child in a yellow dress, rejecting $500,000 without a second thought. "Why are you helping me?" Pablo whispered, the question tearing out of him like a confession. Snow picked up a red crayon and began adding to the drawing on the wall, a stick figure that might have been Pablo, covered in colorful dots that might have been his band-aids. "Because you're hurt," she said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "And because the money man's eyes were mean. Mean eyes mean mean people. My mom taught me that before she got too tired to teach me things." She drew a star above the stick figure's head, then another, filling the space with constellation of protection. Pablo watched her work, understanding with absolute clarity that he'd just witnessed something the syndicate in all its vicious machinery could never comprehend, the kind of loyalty that couldn't be bought, threatened, or broken, the kind that existed simply because it was right. Somewhere in the building, Wolf was likely checking other doors, making other offers, spreading cash like poison. And here in this small room, a child was teaching a killer what it meant to be human. The afternoon light had shifted, turning the room into a theater of long shadows. Snow sat cross-legged on the floor beside Pablo's cot, her homework spread around her in a haphazard constellation of worksheets and broken crayons. She was supposed to be practicing her numbers, but her attention kept drifting back to him, to the serpent coiling up his neck, to the intricate patterns disappearing beneath his blood-soaked collar. "Does it hurt?" she asked finally, abandoning all pretense of mathematics. Her finger traced the air above his skin, following the serpent's path without touching. "When they put the pictures on." Pablo shifted slightly, trying to find a position that didn't make his wound scream. The movement caused his collar to slip lower, revealing more of the designed cherry blossoms in full bloom, their petals scattered by an invisible wind. Beneath them, barely visible, was the outline of a fortress with broken walls. "Yes," he said truthfully, "it hurts quite a lot." "Then why did you let them do it?" The question was innocent, direct in the way only children could be. Pablo stared at the ceiling, at the water stains that looked like continents from forgotten maps. How could he explain that he'd chosen pain as armor, that each needle stroke had been a commitment to a life he couldn't escape, that the tattoos marked him as property of the syndicate as surely as a brand marked cattle? He couldn't, but maybe he could tell her something else, something that contained enough truth to satisfy her curiosity without poisoning her with the reality of what he'd done. "They're not just pictures," Pablo said slowly, his voice rough from disuse and pain. "They're stories. Each one tells something that happened a long time ago." Snow's eyes widened. She abandoned her homework entirely, scooting closer. "Like a book." "Exactly like a book, except instead of pages, the stories are written on skin." She processed this with visible concentration, her small face scrunched in thought. Then she pointed to the serpent. "What's that one about?" Pablo looked at the snake, at the careful detail work that had taken 3 sessions and cost him more money than most people earned in a year. The original story was simple and brutal. He'd killed 6 men in a territorial dispute in Blasian, establishing himself as someone not to be crossed. The serpent represented cunning. The dagger meant he wasn't afraid to strike first. The names written in Korean script were his victims, worn like trophies. But that wasn't the story he told Snow. "Once upon a time," he began, and her face lit up with recognition of those magical words. "There was a kingdom protected by a great silver serpent. But the serpent wasn't evil like most people thought. It guarded a special garden where flowers bloomed even in winter." "Cherry blossoms," Snow interrupted, pointing to the pink petals scattered across his neck. "Exactly. These cherry blossoms had healing powers. If you were sick or hurt, just standing near them would make you better. But there were dragons who wanted to steal the flowers to sell them for gold. They didn't care about healing people. They only cared about getting rich. Pablo paused, gauging her reaction. She was leaning forward now, completely absorbed. He continued, letting the lie build itself, each word carrying him further from the truth and deeper into something that felt strangely like confession. The serpent fought the dragons for many years. Sometimes it won, sometimes it lost, but it always protected the garden because that was its purpose. That was what it was born to do. Did the serpent have a name? Snow asked. The question caught him off guard. In all his years wearing this ink, no one had ever asked what the serpent was called. It was just the marker of his first major killing, his initiation into the upper ranks of the syndicate's enforcement division. Guardian, Pablo said after a moment. Its name was Guardian. Snow nodded with satisfaction, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. And the dagger, is that part of the story too? Pablo looked down at the blade inked between the serpent's coils. In reality, it represented his weapon of choice during those early years, quick, silent, personal. He'd preferred knives to guns, enjoyed the intimacy of close work, the way you could watch the light leave someone's eyes. The dagger was a gift, he said instead, from a wise knight who lived in the fortress. He shifted slightly, revealing more of the broken fortress walls. The knight taught the serpent that strength without wisdom is just destruction. He gave the serpent the dagger as a reminder. Sometimes protecting something means being willing to fight, but you should only fight when there's something worth protecting. Like the flowers, Snow said. Like the flowers. She studied the fortress now, her eyes tracing the crumbling ramparts, the shattered gates. What happened to the castle? Why is it broken? Pablo felt the words stick in his throat. The fortress represented his family's compound and soul, the place where he'd grown up surrounded by violence and money and the grinding machinery of organized crime. The broken walls were literal. The compound had been raided when he was 17, his father killed, his brothers scattered. That night had taught him that nothing was permanent, nothing was safe, and the only person you could truly trust was yourself. There was a great battle, Pablo said carefully. The dragons brought an army. They attacked the fortress because that's where the serpent kept the garden. The knight fought bravely, but there were too many dragons. In the end, the fortress fell. Snow's face crumpled with distress. Did the knight die? Yes, but before he died, he made the serpent promise something very important. He made it promise to take the last cherry blossom seeds and plant them somewhere else. Somewhere the dragons would never find them. Somewhere they could grow in peace. Pablo pulled his collar down further, revealing a small design he'd almost forgotten existed. A tiny seed pod tucked beneath the fortress ruins, so small and subtle that most people never noticed it. He'd gotten it added years later, during a rare moment of sentiment he'd immediately regretted. That's the seed, Snow breathed, delighted. Did the serpent plant it? It's still looking for the right place, Pablo said quietly. The right garden, somewhere safe. The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than he'd intended. Snow reached out then and did something that made Pablo's breath catch. She touched the seed pod gently, her finger warm against his cold skin. Maybe it could plant it here, she suggested. In my room, I could help it grow. Pablo closed his eyes, fighting against the emotion threatening to crack through his carefully maintained armor. This child thought his tattoos were fairy tales. She thought he was a guardian searching for a safe garden instead of a killer running from the consequences of his violence. She saw seeds and potential where there was only destruction and decay. Tell me about that one, Snow said, pointing to another section of ink disappearing beneath his shirt. A crane in flight, its wings spread wide. The crane had been added after his first successful assassination, a high-level politician who'd refused to cooperate with the syndicate's expansion plans. Pablo had made it look like a heart attack, clean and professional. The crane represented ascension, elevation to a new status within the organization. The crane was a messenger, Pablo heard himself say. It carried news between the kingdoms, flying so high that no one could shoot it down. It knew all the secrets, which kings were kind, which were cruel, which kingdoms were prosperous, which were starving. But it never betrayed anyone's trust. It just delivered the messages and flew away. Was it friends with the serpent? Not at first. The serpent didn't trust anyone who knew too many secrets, but eventually they made a deal. The crane would warn the serpent when the dragons were coming, and in return, the serpent would protect the crane's nest. Snow absorbed this, nodding slowly. "Everybody needs friends," she said with the absolute certainty of a child stating a fundamental law of the universe. "Even serpents and cranes and magic people with picture books on their skin." Pablo wanted to tell her she was wrong. That friendship in his world was just another word for vulnerability, another weakness to be exploited. That everyone who'd ever claimed to be his friend had eventually tried to use him, betray him, or kill him. That the only alliance that mattered was the temporary alignment of mutual self-interest. But looking at her face, open, trusting, believing completely in these fabricated fables, he couldn't bring himself to poison that innocence. "What about the words?" Snow asked, squinting at the Korean characters woven between the designs. "Are those magic spells?" Pablo's throat tightened. The words were names. Victims. A permanent record of lives he'd taken before his conscience had completely calcified. But Snow couldn't read Korean characters, couldn't know what they represented. "They're promises," he said hoarsely. "Things the serpent swore to remember, to never forget where it came from, to always protect those who couldn't protect themselves." "That's good," Snow said firmly. "You should write down your promises, otherwise you might forget them when you get old." She returned to her homework then, apparently satisfied with the stories. Pablo lay still, staring at his own skin as if seeing it for the first time. Every line, every symbol, every carefully chosen image was a monument to violence and ambition and cold-blooded calculation. But filtered through Snow's imagination, they'd become something else entirely. A mythology of protection and sacrifice and searching for places where beautiful things could grow safely. Maybe that's what all monsters told themselves in the dark hours, that their violence served some higher purpose, that they were guardians instead of predators. Or maybe, Pablo thought as exhaustion pulled him toward unconscious, maybe Snow saw something in the ink that he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed, some original intention from before the syndicate had twisted him into a weapon. Maybe once, a long time ago, he really had wanted to be the serpent who guarded gardens instead of the snake who struck from shadows. The glass didn't shatter. That would have been too obvious, too loud. Instead, Pablo heard the delicate scrape of a blade against the window frame, the patient work of someone who knew exactly how to breach a locked window without announcing their presence. The sound was so subtle that most people would have missed it entirely, would have dismissed it as the building settling or wind rattling old fixtures. Pablo wasn't most people. His eyes snapped open, every nerve in his broken body suddenly screaming alert. The window was behind Snow's small desk, partially hidden by a curtain made from a bedsheet decorated with faded cartoon characters. Through the thin fabric, he could see a shadow moving with professional efficiency, working the latch open from the outside. They were on the 5th floor, which meant whoever was coming through that window had either climbed the fire escape or rappelled down from the roof. Either way, they were committed. Professionals didn't retreat once they'd started a breach. Snow was at the far end of the room, heating something in a battered microwave that hummed like an angry wasp. She hadn't noticed the window yet, her attention focused on watching the timer count down, her small face illuminated by the appliance's interior light. Pablo had maybe 15 seconds before the intruder cleared the frame. 15 seconds to decide if he had enough strength left to kill quietly. He rolled off the cot with agonizing slowness, biting down on his tongue to keep from crying out as his wound tore open fresh. His hand found the glass of water Snow had left beside him. Not ideal, but it would have to do. The window latch clicked open with a sound like breaking bone. Pablo's mind calculated trajectories and angles with the cold precision of a machine built for murder. The intruder would come through head first, hands occupied with maintaining balance. There would be a 2-second window where they'd be completely vulnerable, suspended between outside and inside, committed to the breach but not yet stable. That's when he'd strike. The curtain moved. A gloved hand gripped the window frame. Pablo pressed himself against the wall, his broken body screaming in protest, his vision tunneling at the edges. The microwave beeped. Snow turned, saw Pablo standing, started to speak. He clamped his hand over her mouth and pulled her behind him in one fluid motion, using his body as a shield. Her eyes went wide with terror and confusion, but she didn't struggle. Smart girl. Impossibly smart girl. The intruder's head cleared the window frame. Male, mid-30s, wearing tactical black. Pablo recognized the pattern, syndicate standard issue for wet work. The man's eyes swept the room with trained efficiency, looking for his target. Those eyes found Pablo at the exact moment Pablo's hand found the man's throat. The glass shattered against the intruder's temple, water and blood mixing as Pablo drove him backward with terrible, desperate strength. The man's mouth opened to shout. Pablo's thumb found the pressure point below his jaw, cutting off air and sound simultaneously. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, Pablo's weight driving them both toward the floor with controlled violence. The intruder was younger, healthier, uninjured. Under normal circumstances, he would have broken Pablo into pieces. But Pablo had two advantages: decades of experience turning human bodies into broken machinery, and the absolute certainty that if he failed, Snow would die. That certainty burned through his pain like acid, giving him strength he shouldn't possess. They hit the floor hard. Pablo felt something tear in his side, felt fresh warmth spreading across his shirt. Didn't matter. The intruder's hand was scrabbling for the pistol in his shoulder holster. Pablo caught the wrist, twisted until tendons snapped like guitar strings. The man's face contorted in silent agony, but Pablo's thumb was still crushing his throat, still preventing any sound from escaping. Snow made a small noise behind him, a whimper of pure terror. The intruder's eyes flickered toward her, and Pablo saw the calculation happening in real time. The man was reaching for his backup piece, a small blade strapped to his ankle, not to fight Pablo, to use as leverage, to put a knife to the child's throat and force compliance. Pablo saw the future in that glance. Snow held hostage, her small body used as a shield, her life bartered for his surrender. He saw Wolf's cold logic made manifest. Children were tools, leverage, acceptable casualties in the pursuit of larger objectives. This man would cut Snow's throat without hesitation if it meant completing his mission. Would probably feel nothing beyond mild inconvenience at the extra cleanup required. Something ancient and primal roared to life in Pablo's chest. His hand found the intruder's jaw, fingers digging into pressure points that made the nervous system short-circuit. The man bucked, convulsed, his survival instincts overriding his training. Pablo rode the movement, using the intruder's own momentum against him, driving his head down and back with controlled, surgical brutality. The angle was perfect, the force precisely calibrated. He felt the vertebrae separate with a sound like wet branches breaking. The intruder went limp, dead weight in every sense of the phrase. Pablo held the position for another 5 seconds, making absolutely certain. His hands were shaking now, adrenaline and blood loss creating a toxic cocktail that made his vision swim. He released the corpse carefully, rolling it away from the window, away from Snow's line of sight. The entire encounter had lasted less than 30 seconds, completely silent except for the impact of bodies on floor and the sharp crack of breaking bone. Pablo turned, his body moving on autopilot, checking Snow's face for trauma. She was pale, trembling, her hands pressed over her mouth, but her eyes weren't vacant with shock. They were sharp, focused, processing what she'd just witnessed with that terrible, premature wisdom he'd seen before. She'd grown up in these slums. She'd seen violence before, understood it the way children in war zones understood the sound of artillery. "Is he sleeping?" she whispered, the question revealing her desperate need to believe in a gentler reality than the one Pablo had just demonstrated. Pablo wanted to lie, wanted to preserve that innocence for just a few more hours, but lies wouldn't keep her safe. Understanding might. "No," he said quietly. "He's not sleeping. He was going to hurt you to get to me. I couldn't let that happen." Snow's lower lip trembled. A single tear traced down her cheek, but she didn't look away, didn't close her eyes. She stared at the body with the same intense focus she'd used when studying his tattoos, as if trying to memorize every detail of this moment, cataloging it in whatever mental space, She used to store the hard truths of her young life. "There will be more," Pablo continued, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and pain. "The man who knocked on the door, Wolf, he's not going to stop. They'll keep coming until they find me or until I'm gone. Do you understand what that means?" Snow nodded slowly. "They'll hurt me even if I didn't do anything wrong, because I'm in the way." The clarity of her understanding broke something in Pablo's chest. 6 years old, and she already knew the fundamental law of predators. Innocent bystanders were just obstacles to be removed. No hesitation, no mercy, no consideration beyond the immediate objective. "I need to get you somewhere safe," Pablo said. "Somewhere far from here. Do you have family, grandparents, anyone who could?" "No one," Snow interrupted, her voice flat. "My grandma died when I was little. My dad left before I was born. It's just me and my mom, and she's—" She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Pablo closed his eyes, the tactical situation crystallizing with terrible clarity. He couldn't leave her here. That was essentially signing her death warrant. The syndicate would interrogate her, probably torture her for information about where he'd gone. A 6-year-old wouldn't hold out long under that kind of pressure, and even if she somehow did, they'd kill her anyway to eliminate witnesses. But taking her with him was almost as dangerous. He was bleeding, weak, hunted by an organization with infinite resources and absolutely no moral boundaries. Dragging a child through that would be like painting a target on her back. Yet the alternative, abandoning her to whatever fate the syndicate had planned, was unthinkable. The old Pablo, the Phantom of Sangdo District, would have calculated the odds coldly and chosen the option with the highest survival probability for himself. Would have slipped out the window and left Snow to face Wolf's questions alone. But the old Pablo wouldn't have told fairy tales about guardian serpents and healing gardens. Wouldn't have let a child decorate his face with cartoon band-aids. Wouldn't have felt his chest crack open at the sight of her tear-stained face, trying so hard to be brave. Pablo looked down at the corpse cooling on the floor, at the evidence of what the syndicate was willing to do. This man had climbed 5 stories, breached a locked window, all with the full knowledge that killing a child was a possibility, maybe even a requirement of the job. The organization Pablo had served for 3 decades operated with industrial efficiency, grinding up innocence and dignity and humanity in pursuit of profit and power. And he'd been part of that machine. He'd been the teeth that did the grinding. Snow was watching him, waiting for a decision. Behind her, the makeshift curtain fluttered in the breeze from the open window. Outside, the city hummed with its usual indifferent chaos. Somewhere in that chaos, Wolf was coordinating a systematic sweep, tightening the noose floor by floor, room by room. More intruders would come. Better prepared, more ruthless. "Can you be very quiet and very brave?" Pablo asked, meeting Snow's eyes directly. "Braver than you've ever been before." She nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Then we're leaving, right now. We're going to turn this building into a maze and we're going to disappear into it. But I need you to do exactly what I say, exactly when I say it. Can you do that?" "Yes," Snow whispered, then stronger. "Yes, I can do that." Pablo pushed himself to his feet, using the wall for support. Fresh blood soaked through his makeshift bandages. He had maybe 2 hours of functional movement left before his body completely shut down. 2 hours to navigate a building filled with professional killers and get a 6-year-old to safety. The old Pablo would have said the odds were impossible. But the old Pablo had never had something worth protecting. Pablo moved through Snow's small desk with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd searched 1,000 rooms for intelligence. They had maybe 3 minutes before someone noticed the intruders missed check-in, maybe 5 before they sent backup. He needed to understand this building's layout, identify exits, map the territory. Snow's drawings covered most surfaces, but beneath them he found what he was looking for: old mail, utility bills, anything with names and addresses. His hands froze on a faded envelope wedged between 2 textbooks. The return address was printed in the corner, institutional and cold. Seoul Metropolitan Detention Center, Ward 7. The letter was addressed to Yoon Mi-sun and family. Pablo's fingers trembled as he pulled out the paper inside, already knowing what he'd find but praying he was wrong. The handwriting was cramped, desperate, the kind of script produced by someone who hadn't held a pen in years. "My dearest me son and precious daughter." "That's from my daddy," Snow said quietly from behind him. She'd been gathering her few belongings into a small backpack, a change of clothes, the tackle box of medical supplies, 3 crayons she apparently couldn't live without. Now she stood watching him with those 2 old eyes. "He writes sometimes. Mommy keeps them even though reading them makes her cry." Pablo scanned the letter, his vision blurring at the edges. The writer talked about regret, about choices he wished he could unmake, about a job that was supposed to be simple, supposed to be safe, about how he'd trusted the wrong people, about how he'd never even met his daughter, how his one photograph of her was creased from being folded and unfolded 1,000 times in his cell. The letter was dated 4 years ago. "What's your father's name?" Pablo asked, his voice sounding like it came from underwater. "Yoon Taejin," Snow said, "but I never met him. He went away before I was born. Mommy said he made a mistake and had to go somewhere to think about it for a long time." Yoon Taejin. The name detonated in Pablo's memory like a grenade he'd forgotten was armed. Images cascaded through his mind with terrible clarity. A nervous kid, maybe 22, recruited as a low-level courier for a pharmaceutical intercept job. The syndicate had needed someone expendable, someone with no connections, no experience, no value beyond their willingness to carry a package from point A to point B. Pablo had personally selected Taejin from a lineup of desperate candidates, chosen him specifically because he looked forgettable, unremarkable, like someone police would glance past. The job had been a setup from the beginning. The syndicate needed someone to take the fall for a larger operation, needed a body to throw at the authorities while the real shipment went through a different route. Pablo had known this, had selected Taejin anyway, handed him a package containing enough evidence to guarantee 20 years minimum, told him the pickup location, watched him walk into the trap with the trusting eagerness of someone who thought they'd finally caught a break. Pablo had been there when the police closed in, had watched from across the street as Taejin realized he'd been betrayed, watched the exact moment hope died in the kid's eyes, and was replaced by the terrible understanding that he'd been nothing but a sacrificial pawn. Taejin had looked directly at Pablo through the crowd, making eye contact, silently begging for help that would never come. Pablo had turned and walked away. The operation had been a textbook success. The real shipment cleared customs while every cop and soul was busy processing Taejin. The syndicate had made millions. Pablo had received a bonus and a promotion. Taejin had received 2 decades in a cage for a crime he'd been tricked into committing. And now Pablo was standing in the room of Taejin's daughter, the child he'd never met, the family he'd abandoned. However, inadvertently, when he'd trusted Pablo's lies about a simple courier job. "Are you okay?" Snow asked, her small hand touching his arm. "You look sick, more sick than before." Pablo's knees buckled. He caught himself against the desk, but barely. The wound in his side was screaming, but that pain was nothing compared to the crushing weight settling onto his chest. This wasn't abstract guilt over nameless victims or philosophical regret over a violent career. This was concrete, specific, undeniable. This little girl who'd hidden him, healed him, trusted him, he'd destroyed her family before she was even born. "Your father," Pablo managed. "The letter says he's in detention. What did your mother tell you about what happened?" Snow's face clouded with the careful neutrality children develop when discussing painful topics. "She said Daddy wanted to make money so they could get married and have a nice house. She said someone told him they had a job, and he thought it would be easy money. But it was a trick. The police caught him with bad medicine, and now he has to stay in the detention center until I'm old." Bad medicine, pharmaceutical intercept. The details aligned perfectly with Pablo's memory. "Mommy visits him sometimes when she has money for the bus," Snow continued, her voice small. "She takes pictures of me to show him. He has one by his bed. She told me that. He looks at it every night and tells me good night even though I can't hear him." Pablo's hand found the edge of the cot, gripping it hard enough that his knuckles went white. The universe's sense of irony was exquisite. Of all the rooms in Seoul, of all the desperate bolt holes he could have stumbled into, he'd found the one belonging to the family of a man he'd casually destroyed for profit. Was this karma? Divine retribution? Just the random cruelty of a cosmos that delighted in grinding people into ever finer pieces? "Do you remember the man's name?" Pablo heard himself ask. "The one who gave your father the job. Did your mother ever mention it?" Snow shook her head. "She just calls him the monster. She says monsters look like regular people sometimes. They smile and make promises and then they hurt you." The monster? Pablo had been called many things in his career: the Phantom, the Ghost of Sangdo, the Wolf, the Reaper, but never something as simple and devastatingly accurate as monster. That's what he was to me, son, to this broken family. Not a complex anti-hero or a tragic figure, just a monster who smiled and made promises and destroyed their lives without a second thought. "My mommy cries about it sometimes," Snow said softly. "When she thinks I'm sleeping. She talks to my daddy's picture and says she's sorry she can't afford a good lawyer. Says she's sorry they have to live here instead of somewhere nice. Says she's sorry I have to eat rice and vegetables instead of meat." Each word was a knife finding the spaces between Pablo's ribs. Me son was working herself to exhaustion, literally dying in a hospital bed from overwork and stress, trying to support a child and an imprisoned husband, all because Pablo had needed a disposable pawn for a game whose stakes she'd never understand. Pablo looked at Snow's drawings on the wall with new eyes. They weren't just a child's innocent art. They were the product of a little girl whose father existed only in photographs and smuggled letters, whose mother worked brutal hours in whatever jobs would take her, whose childhood had been stolen by circumstances she couldn't comprehend. The stick figures holding hands weren't random. They were a family that had never existed, a dream of normalcy drawn in crayon, because reality offered nothing but absence and poverty. "I need to tell you something," Pablo said, the words tearing out of him like shrapnel. "Your father." A sound cut through the moment. Footsteps in the hallway, multiple pairs, moving with coordinated precision. Wolf's voice drifted through the door, giving orders in the clipped tone of a man who'd done this 1,000 times. They were doing a hard sweep now, checking every apartment whether the occupants cooperated or not. The confession died in Pablo's throat. What could he say? "I'm the monster your mother talks about. I'm the reason your father is in prison. I'm the reason you've never felt his arms around you or heard his voice tell you goodnight in person." How could those words possibly matter when they had maybe 60 seconds before armed men kicked down the door? But Snow was looking at him with those impossibly wise eyes, waiting. She deserved the truth, even if there was no time for it. "Your father isn't in prison because he made a mistake," Pablo whispered urgently, kneeling down to her eye level despite the agony it caused. "He's there because someone used him, someone bad, someone who didn't care what happened to him or your mother or you." Snow's expression didn't change. "I know, Mommy told me. She said the world is full of people who use other people and throw them away." Pablo stopped, the confession choking him. "I was that person. I am that person." But the footsteps were getting closer, and there was no time for absolution he didn't deserve anyway. "We have to go," he said instead, standing with enormous effort. "Right now." But Snow caught his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his blood-stained ones. "The serpent in your story," she said quietly. "The one who protected the garden. Did it ever do bad things before it became a guardian?" Pablo stared at her. This impossible child who somehow understood more than she should, who was offering him a framework for redemption he had no right to accept. "Yes," he admitted. "The serpent did terrible things, hurt people who didn't deserve it, destroyed families. It was a monster pretending to be a guardian." "But then it met the flowers," Snow said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "And it decided to protect them instead. It decided to be different." The footsteps stopped outside the door. A hand tested the knob. "Can monsters decide to be different?" Snow asked. Pablo looked at her, at Tijan's daughter, the child of the man he'd betrayed, the living embodiment of consequences he'd never bothered to consider. In her eyes he saw not hatred or fear, but a question that cut deeper than any blade. What are you going to choose to be? The door handle began to turn. Yes, Pablo said, pulling her toward the window where the dead intruder had entered. Monsters can decide to be different, starting right now. Pablo's mind shifted into combat mode the moment he heard the distinctive click of tactical boots assembling in the stairwell. 4 sets minimum, maybe 6, moving with the coordinated precision of a military sweep. They weren't bothering with subtlety anymore. Wolf had pulled back the velvet glove to reveal the iron fist underneath. The apartment building was a decaying Soviet-era structure, 7 stories of crumbling concrete and narrow corridors that had housed the desperate and displaced for decades. Pablo had studied buildings like this during his early training, understood their architecture the way a predator understands terrain. The syndicate owned half the units through shell companies and intimidated landlords, which meant Wolf would have keys to most doors, floor plans memorized, and probably already positioned blockers at the main exits. Snow stood by the window, clutching her small backpack, her face pale but composed. She'd pushed the dead intruder's body behind her desk with a pragmatism that broke Pablo's heart. 6 years old and already treating corpses like furniture to be rearranged. "Do you know the building's layout?" Pablo asked quietly, his tactical mind mapping possibilities. "All the exits, the maintenance areas, the places adults don't usually go." Snow nodded. "I know everywhere. Me and the other kids play hide and seek. We know all the secret spots." "Show me." She moved to her desk and pulled out a piece of paper, already covered with crayon drawings. She flipped it over and began sketching with a purple marker, her small hand moving with surprising precision. The result was crude but accurate, a child's understanding of architecture filtered through dozens of games played in shadows. "Main stairs here and here," she said, marking 2 vertical lines. "But they're always watching those. There's a back stairwell that goes to the roof, but the door at the bottom is locked. There's a laundry chute that goes all the way down to the basement, but it's really narrow and dark." Pablo studied the makeshift map, his years of experience filling in the gaps. The building was a vertical maze, each floor identical except for the variations occupants had made. Walls knocked down, rooms subdivided, illegal modifications that created unexpected passages and dead ends. "What about the basement?" he asked. "How many exits?" "2. One goes to the street, but there's always people there. The other goes to the old delivery tunnel, but it floods when it rains and there's rats." A delivery tunnel. Pablo's pulse quickened. Most buildings this age had underground service corridors connecting to adjacent structures, remnants of an era when maintenance crews needed protected access during harsh winters. If it hadn't been completely sealed off, it might lead to the neighboring building, possibly even to the subway maintenance tunnels beyond. "The tunnel, where does it go?" "I don't know. Mommy said never go in there. She said kids went in and got lost and never came back." Which meant it was either genuinely dangerous or the perfect deterrent story to keep children away from something adults wanted hidden. Pablo would bet on the latter. Old delivery tunnels were ideal for smuggling routes, illegal storage, off-books operations. The syndicate probably used it regularly, which meant it would definitely have an exit. The sound of a door being kicked in echoed from somewhere above them. 6th floor, Pablo's instincts told him. They were starting from the top and working down, systematic and thorough. Maybe 20 minutes before they reached the 5th floor. Less if someone noticed the dead intruder's absence. "We need to move now," Pablo said, forcing his body upright despite the screaming protest from his wound. "But we're not running away. We're going to lead them on a chase through every floor, every corridor, make them think I'm moving up when I'm moving down, make them spread their resources thin." Snow looked at him with those ancient eyes. "You're going to trick them, like the crane in your story." "Exactly like that. But I need you to be my eyes. You know this building better than they do. You know which doors are unlocked, which apartments have old people who won't open up, which ones have people who'd sell us out for a reward." She considered this, her small face grave. "Mrs. Han on 7 never opens her door. She's scared of everything. The Kim family on 4 has 6 kids and they're always screaming, so the bad men won't hear us there. Mr. Cho on 3 works nights, so his apartment is empty during the day. Pablo listened, committing every detail to memory. This wasn't just a building, it was a living ecosystem, and Snow understood its rhythms the way he understood the patterns of violence. "Here's what we're going to do," he said, kneeling despite the pain. "We'll move to the 6th floor using the back stairs. I'll create a disturbance there, make them think I'm trying to reach the roof. While they commit resources up, we'll double back and go down. We'll hit multiple floors, leave traces, keep them guessing. Eventually we'll work our way to the basement and that delivery tunnel." "But you're hurt," Snow said, her voice small. "You're bleeding again, I can see it through your shirt." Pablo looked down. She was right. Fresh crimson was soaking through his makeshift bandages, the earlier exertion having torn his wound wider. He had maybe an hour of peak performance left before blood loss dragged him into shock, but an hour would have to be enough. "I've functioned on worse," he lied, though it wasn't entirely false. He'd completed operations with broken ribs, dislocated shoulders, gunshot wounds. Pain was just information, and information could be managed. He moved to the intruder's body and began systematically stripping it of useful equipment. A pistol with suppressor, 2 spare magazines, a combat knife, zip ties, a radio that was already crackling with status updates. Pablo pocketed the weapons and put the radio to his ear. Wolf's voice came through, calm and professional. "Team 2, 6th floor clear. Moving to 5. Team 1, maintain position at ground-level exits. Team 3, I want eyes on the fire escapes. If he tries to spider climb down, I want him picked off clean." Pablo switched off the radio and crushed it under his heel. Leaving it active would let them track him, but destroying it would tell them something had gone wrong with their window breach. They'd start asking questions, maybe accelerate their timeline. "Put this on," he said to Snow, handing her the intruder's tactical jacket. It was huge on her, reaching nearly to her ankles, but it was dark and would help her blend into shadows. She pulled it on without complaint, then looked up at him. "Are we going to make it?" The question was direct, unflinching. She deserved the same in return. "I don't know," Pablo admitted. "They have more people, more weapons, and they know this is my last stand. But we have something they don't, we have you. They think I'm alone, desperate, making random choices. They don't know I have a guide who knows every secret this building holds." "Like the crane helping the serpent," Snow said. "Exactly." Pablo checked the pistol, full magazine, round-chambered, suppressor properly attached. The weapon felt foreign in his hands after years of preferring blades, but he'd need the stopping power. Close quarters combat while protecting a child wasn't the time for finesse. The corridor outside had gone quiet, the pregnant silence before a storm. They were regrouping, adjusting their sweep pattern based on the intelligence that their window breach had failed. Soon they'd kick in every door on this floor, and Snow's apartment would be early in the sequence. "The back stairwell," Pablo said urgently. "How do we access it without going into the main corridor?" Snow pointed to her wall, to a section where the crayon drawings seemed particularly concentrated. "There's a crawl space. It goes through to the next apartment, and they have a door to the back stairs, but you have to be small to fit." Pablo approached the wall and ran his hands over it, finding the seam hidden beneath layers of taped artwork. Someone had cut a rough passage through the plaster and covered it with a thin board. He pulled the board free, revealing a gap barely 2 feet square. "Snow can definitely fit," he said, studying the opening. "I'll have to try." He went through first, pushing his shoulders into the gap with his arms extended forward, ignoring the way the rough edges tore at his wound. The space was suffocatingly tight, designed for children to slip through, not grown men with broad shoulders. Pablo had to exhale completely and pull himself forward with his fingertips, feeling the walls scrape skin from his back. He emerged into darkness, an abandoned apartment that smelled of mildew and rat droppings. Snow came through behind him like a shadow, quick and silent. Pablo helped her to her feet and listened. The neighboring apartment was tomb quiet, probably unoccupied for months. The door to the back stairwell hung crooked on its hinges. Pablo eased it open, weapon raised. The stairwell was narrow and poorly lit, with graffiti covering the walls and cigarette butts littering the landing. But it was empty. "Up first," Pablo whispered. "We need to make them think I'm running for the roof." They climbed quickly, Pablo's legs burning with effort, his vision swimming at the edges. On the 6th-floor landing, he used the combat knife to slash his palm, fresh blood that he smeared on the door handle, and sprayed in a convincing pattern across the landing. Evidence of an injured man forcing his way through, leaving a trail. Then they reversed direction, moving down with agonizing care. Pablo could hear the main sweep team entering the 5th floor, doors being kicked in with methodical violence. Wolf's voice carried through the walls, coldly professional as he directed his people. They passed the 5th-floor landing, then the 4th. On the 3rd floor, Pablo made another deliberate blood mark, this time on the wall facing the wrong direction. Confusion and misdirection. Make them waste resources checking cleared floors. Snow's hand found his, her small fingers squeezing with surprising strength. "We're almost to the basement," she whispered. "But there's going to be guards. They always watch the exits." Pablo nodded. Of course there would be guards. Wolf wasn't an amateur, but guards could be dealt with. The tunnel was the key. If it led where Pablo hoped, they might actually have a chance. They reached the basement landing. Voices echoed from beyond the door. At least 2 guards, maybe 3. Pablo checked his pistol one final time, made sure Snow was pressed against the wall behind him, and prepared for the violence that would come next. The serpent, he thought grimly, was about to remind the dragons why they'd feared it in the first place. The basement door opened onto a concrete corridor lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that cast everything in nauseating green-white pulses. Pablo's eyes adjusted quickly, cataloging threats with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent 3 decades surviving impossible situations. 2 guards at the far end near the street exit, assault rifles held with casual competence. 1 more patrolling the center junction where 4 corridors intersected. All wearing syndicate colors, all equipped with radios that would summon reinforcements in seconds. Pablo pressed Snow against the wall behind a stack of abandoned furniture, his hand over her mouth to muffle any sound. She nodded understanding, her eyes wide but focused. He could feel her heartbeat against his palm, rapid but controlled. Not panic, just adrenaline. The patrol guard turned his back, moving toward the laundry room. Pablo had maybe 8 seconds while the man was out of sight of his companions. 8 seconds to cross 20 feet of open corridor and reach the delivery tunnel entrance Snow had indicated, a rusted metal door half hidden behind a broken water heater. He moved. 3 decades of training compressed into fluid motion. Pablo crossed the distance in near silence, Snow's small hand gripped in his, pulling her along. They reached the water heater just as the patrol guard's radio crackled to life. Wolf's voice, sharp with frustration. "6th-floor blood trail is a misdirection. He's moving down, not up. Converge on basement level, all teams." The guard spun around, weapon rising. His eyes found Pablo at the exact moment Pablo's knife found his throat. The man made a wet, choking sound and crumpled. Pablo caught the body before it could hit the floor with a noise that would alert the others, lowered it gently behind the water heater. "Don't look," he whispered to Snow, positioning himself to block her view. But she'd already turned away, her small body pressed against the wall, hands covering her ears. Learning to survive by learning not to see. The delivery tunnel door was locked, but the lock was old. A simple pin tumbler that Pablo picked in 15 seconds with tools he'd stripped from the dead window intruder. The door groaned open on rusted hinges, revealing darkness that smelled of stagnant water and decay. Behind them, voices shouted. The guards at the street exit had noticed their patrol partner was missing. Pablo shoved Snow through the tunnel entrance and followed, pulling the door shut just as flashlight beams swept the corridor. The darkness was absolute. Pablo felt Snow's hand find his, her fingers trembling now that there was no one to see her fear. He pulled out the tactical flashlight he'd taken from the intruder and clicked it on, revealing a nightmare landscape. The tunnel stretched ahead for maybe 60 yards before curving out of sight. Water covered the floor ankle-deep, its surface reflecting their light in oily rainbows. The walls were covered in fungus and graffiti, layers of decay and desperate human marking. Rats scattered from the light, their eyes reflecting red as they disappeared into crevices. "Stay close," Pablo whispered. "Step exactly where I step." They waded forward, water soaking through their shoes with each step. The tunnel had been a delivery corridor once. Pablo could see the remnants of old rail tracks beneath the water, rusted into uselessness. Now it was just another forgotten space where the city's infrastructure slowly rotted. Behind them, the door exploded inward with a shower of rust and splintered wood. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, followed by voices shouting coordinates and tactical positions. They'd found the tunnel. Of course they had. Wolf was thorough, methodical. He would have known about this route, probably had the plans memorized. Pablo ran, pulling Snow along, no longer concerned with stealth. Speed was everything now. The tunnel curved, opened into a wider chamber where 3 passages intersected. Water dripped from somewhere above, echoing in the darkness. Pablo chose the left passage at random, praying it led somewhere other than a dead end. Gunfire erupted behind them, automatic weapons fire that turned the tunnel into a percussion chamber of sound. Bullets ricocheted off concrete walls, sending chips of stone spinning into the water. Pablo felt one pass close enough to kiss his ear, felt another tear through his jacket. He threw himself forward, covering Snow's body with his own as they collapsed into the water. The cold was shocking, the filth immediate. But they were below the line of fire now, bullets passing overhead as the shooters adjusted their aim. Pablo crawled forward, dragging Snow beneath him, using his body as a literal shield between her and the weapons behind them. Each movement tore at his wound, sent fresh blood mixing with the contaminated water. His vision was graying at the edges, shock and blood loss finally catching up with what adrenaline had been holding at bay. The passage narrowed, forcing them into a maintenance crawlway barely 3 feet high. Pablo's shoulders scraped against both walls as he pushed Snow ahead of him. Behind them, the gunfire paused. They'd moved beyond effective range, or the shooters were advancing to flush them out. "Keep going," Pablo gasped, his voice rough with pain. "Don't stop, don't wait for me. Just follow the tunnel until you see light." "I'm not leaving you," Snow said, her voice fierce despite the tears streaming down her face. "The crane doesn't leave the serpent. That's not how the story works." Footsteps echoed in the tunnel behind them, multiple sets, moving with tactical precision. Flashlight beams swept the darkness, searching. Pablo could hear Wolf's voice now, not over the radio but in person, close enough to make out individual words. "Pablo," Wolf called out, his voice echoing off the tunnel walls. "This is pathetic. You're bleeding out in rat-infested water, dragging a child through filth to delay the inevitable. Is this really how the Phantom of Sangdo wants to end? Drowning in sewage?" Pablo kept moving, ignoring the taunt, focusing on the simple mechanics of forward motion. Left hand, right knee, pull. Right hand, left knee, pull. Snow ahead of him, her small body silhouetted against the faint glow that might have been an exit or might have been hallucination. "You helped build this system," Wolf continued, his voice growing closer. "You taught me everything I know about efficiency, about treating people as resources to be expended. Remember Yoon Taejin? That courier job was your masterpiece, sacrificing one meaningless life to protect millions in profit. You were brilliant at it." The words hit harder than bullets. Pablo had tried not to think about Taejin since finding those letters, tried to compartmentalize the knowledge that Snow's broken family was his creation. But Wolf was forcing the mirror into his face, showing him exactly what he'd been, what he'd taught others to become. "The girl's father is still in prison because of you," Wolf said, and Pablo could hear the smile in his voice. "Does she know that? Does she know the man she's protecting destroyed her family before she was born? That's poetry, Pablo. That's the kind of symmetry the universe delivers when you've lived like we have." Snow had stopped moving. She was looking back at Pablo, her face barely visible in the dim light. She'd heard. Of course she'd heard. Wolf had made sure of it. "Is it true?" she whispered. "Are you the monster who hurt my daddy?" Pablo wanted to lie, wanted to offer some rationalization that would make it bearable. But he'd already decided to be different, and different meant honesty even when it destroyed him. "Yes," he said. "I chose your father because he looked innocent, because police would believe he'd made a stupid mistake. I set him up knowing exactly what would happen to him. I never thought about you or your mother. I never thought about anyone except the mission." Snow's face crumpled. Fresh tears cut tracks through the grime on her cheeks. Behind them, Wolf laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "See that, little one? That's what monsters do. They smile and make promises and destroy everything they touch. Your mother was right. And now the monster is using you to save himself one more time. Using your innocence, your trust, just like he used your father's desperation." The footsteps were close now, maybe 20 yards back. Pablo could see shadows moving against the tunnel walls, could hear the distinctive sound of weapons being readied for close-quarters combat. "But here's the beautiful part," Wolf continued, and Pablo recognized the tone. This was the closer, the final move before the kill. "I'm not going to hurt you, little Snow. I'm going to let you go, right now. Just step away from Pablo and walk back toward my voice. We'll get you cleaned up, take you to your mother, maybe even arrange a family visit to see your father. All you have to do is leave the monster where he belongs, dying in the dark." Pablo felt Snow's weight shift. She was considering it. Why wouldn't she? He'd destroyed her family, used her as a shield, dragged her through violence and horror. Every rational calculation said she should abandon him to the fate he'd earned. "The serpent was supposed to protect the garden," Snow said quietly, more to herself than to Pablo or Wolf. "But it burned the garden first. It killed all the flowers before it learned they were worth saving." Pablo closed his eyes, waiting for her to leave. It would be the smart choice, the survival choice. The choice he'd taught an entire generation of syndicate soldiers to make: preserve yourself, sacrifice others, efficiency over sentiment. But Snow's hand found his in the darkness, small fingers wrapping around his blood-slicked palm with surprising strength. "The story isn't over yet," she said. "The serpent still has to plant the last seed. That's how it becomes a guardian instead of a monster, by saving one flower even if it costs everything." Wolf's laughter died. "Stupid child, monsters don't change, they just find new victims." "My brother's right about one thing," came a new voice, deeper, colder, carrying the weight of absolute authority. Pablo's blood turned to ice. He knew that voice, had grown up hearing it. "Monsters don't change, they just reveal what they've always been." Dante Caselli emerged from the darkness behind Wolf, flanked by 4 more soldiers. Pablo's older brother, the architect of the syndicate's current incarnation, the man who'd ordered Pablo's execution when he'd become inconvenient to the organization's evolution. Pablo saw himself reflected in Dante's face, the same cold calculation, the same willingness to sacrifice anything for strategic advantage. This was who he'd been, who he'd trained himself to become. Wolf was just a pale imitation, but Dante was the genuine article. The perfect predator, utterly convinced that sentiment was weakness and efficiency was virtue. "You taught me well, little brother," Dante said, moving closer. "Everything I know about ruthless pragmatism, I learned from you. The difference is I had the courage to apply those lessons even when they became personally inconvenient, even when they meant removing family." The light ahead grew brighter. An exit. Maybe 30 feet away, a metal ladder leading up to what looked like a storm drain grate. Freedom was close enough to touch. But Dante stood between them and salvation, weapon raised, surrounded by soldiers who would execute any order without hesitation. The toxic system Pablo had helped build was now personified in his brother's face, all his worst qualities amplified and perfected. "Last chance," Dante said. "Give me the girl and I'll make it quick. Keep playing hero and I'll make sure you both drown in this filth." Pablo looked at Snow, at this impossible child who'd seen his worst nature and chosen to believe in his best. Then he looked at his brother, seeing the reflection of everything he'd been. The serpent had a choice: die as the monster he'd always been, or become the guardian by planting one last seed in soil watered with his own blood. Pablo chose. Pablo moved before conscious thought could interfere, his body acting on 3 decades of lethal instinct, compressed into a single explosive moment. He shoved Snow toward the ladder with all his remaining strength, sending her small body sprawling into the water near the exit. At the same instant, he launched himself sideways into Dante's line of fire. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, the muzzle flash turning the tunnel into a strobe-lit nightmare. Pablo felt the bullet punch through his shoulder, not the wounded side, mercifully, but the impact still drove him to his knees. He kept moving through the pain, driving forward into Dante's center mass, using his weight and momentum to knock his brother off balance. They went down together into the filthy water, a tangle of limbs and violence, and 30 years of brotherhood turned poison. Pablo's knife found Dante's ribs, but his brother twisted away at the last second, the blade scoring across Kevlar instead of finding flesh. Dante's elbow caught Pablo's jaw, snapping his head back with enough force to gray his vision. "Run!" Pablo screamed at Snow, the word tearing from his throat. "Climb, don't look back." Through the chaos of combat, he saw her hesitate for one precious second, torn between obedience and loyalty. Then survival instinct won. She scrambled toward the ladder, her small hands finding the rusted rungs, pulling herself up toward the light. Dante's soldiers opened fire, but the tunnel was too narrow, the targets too entangled. Bullets sparked off concrete and metal, ricocheting wildly. One of the soldiers went down screaming, hit by his own team's friendly fire. The others held their shots, waiting for a clear target. Pablo used the momentary chaos to drive his knee into Dante's solar plexus, following with a headbutt that shattered his brother's nose. Blood exploded across both their faces, mixing with the contaminated water. Dante responded with brutal efficiency, his thumbs finding Pablo's wounded shoulder and digging in with surgical precision. The pain was transcendent. Pablo's vision whited out completely, his body trying to shut down, to escape into unconsciousness. But he couldn't allow that. Snow was still climbing, still vulnerable. Every second he kept Dante occupied was another rung she climbed toward safety. He bit down on Dante's thumb, felt bone crack between his teeth, tasted blood that might have been his brother's or his own. Dante howled and released the shoulder, giving Pablo space to roll away. He came up on his knees, weapon drawn, but his hands were shaking too badly to aim properly. Wolf appeared through the smoke and darkness, his own pistol tracking toward the ladder where Snow had just reached the top. Pablo didn't think. He threw himself into the line of fire again, heard the shot, felt nothing. Missed. Wolf adjusted his aim for a second shot. Pablo's gun spoke first. The suppressed round caught Wolf in the chest, driving him backward into the water. Not a kill shot. The Kevlar had absorbed most of the impact, but enough to disrupt his aim by another few seconds. Above them, metal screamed. Snow was forcing the storm drain grate open, her small body leveraging strength that should have been impossible. Rain was falling through the opening. Pablo could see it now, drops of water catching light from the street above. She was almost out, almost safe. Dante surged up from the water like a nightmare given form, his broken nose making his face into a mask of blood and rage. "You're dying for a child who hates you," he snarled, advancing with his knife drawn. "For the daughter of a man you destroyed. That's not redemption, Pablo. That's just pathetic." "I know," Pablo said, raising his own blade with trembling hands. "But it's all I have left to offer." They came together in a clash of steel and desperation. Dante was faster, stronger, uninjured. He drove Pablo backward with a series of precise strikes that opened new wounds across arms and chest. Pablo gave ground, his vision tunneling, his body operating on fumes and will alone. But he was still Pablo Caselli, still the Phantom, and if this was his last fight, he would make it count. He caught Dante's wrist on the next strike, twisted with the last reserves of his strength, and drove his brother into the tunnel wall. The impact dislodged one of the flickering fluorescent tubes, sending it crashing down in a shower of glass and sparks. Darkness swallowed them, broken only by the distant light from the storm drain above. In the dark, Pablo heard Snow's voice. "I'm out, I'm safe." Those 3 words were everything. Pablo felt something release in his chest, not surrender but completion. She was out. She was safe. Whatever happened to him now didn't matter. He drove his knife forward blindly, felt it find resistance, sink deep. Dante's gasp of pain was music. Pablo twisted the blade and pushed, using the last of his strength to drive his brother backward, away from the ladder, away from Snow. "Go," he screamed upward. "Run and don't stop. Find people, find police, find anyone. Tell them." His words were cut off as Wolf's arm wrapped around his throat from behind, cutting off air. Pablo released the knife still buried in Dante's side and fought the chokehold, but his strength was gone. He was operating on empty, his body finally giving in to the accumulated damage. The world was going gray, then black, consciousness slipping away like water through desperate fingers. The last thing he heard was the sound of small feet running across wet pavement above, growing fainter, becoming memory. Snow was running. Snow was alive. That was enough. Then the darkness took him completely. He woke to rain on his face and the taste of blood in his mouth. Pablo's eyes opened to an overcast sky weeping cold drops that washed some of the filth from his skin. He was lying on pavement, his body a symphony of agony. Every breath was knives. Every heartbeat was a countdown. He tried to move and couldn't. His legs wouldn't respond. When he looked down, he understood why. He'd been shot at least 3 more times while unconscious, probably while they dragged him up from the tunnel. Professional placement, designed to incapacitate without killing immediately. They wanted him aware for what came next. Boots appeared in his limited field of vision. Expensive Italian leather, polished despite the rain. Dante crouched down, one hand pressed against his side where Pablo's knife had found him. The wound wasn't fatal, Pablo could tell from how his brother moved, but it would hurt for months. "Where is she?" Dante demanded, his broken nose making his voice nasal, almost comical. Would have been funny if Pablo wasn't dying. Pablo managed something between a laugh and a cough. "Gone, safe, beyond your reach." Wolf appeared beside Dante, his chest showing the bruise from Pablo's shot but otherwise functional. "The girl won't get far. She's 6 years old alone in the rain. We'll have her in an hour." "You won't," Pablo whispered, each word costing him. "Because she knows how to disappear, knows how to survive. You taught her that, by making her life hell, by making sure she learned that monsters look like regular people." Dante's fist caught Pablo's jaw, snapping his head to the side. "Noble until the end. Tell me, brother, does it feel good, throwing away everything for a child who will never remember your name, who will grow up knowing you as the monster who destroyed her family?" Pablo turned his head back, met his brother's eyes directly. In them he saw his own reflection from years ago, cold, calculating, convinced that sentiment was weakness. But he also saw something else now. He saw fear. Fear that maybe Pablo had found something worth more than power. Fear that maybe the old way, the syndicate way, wasn't the only way. "She'll remember," Pablo said with absolute certainty. "She'll remember that monsters can choose to be different, that the serpent can become a guardian even if it costs everything." "Poetic," Wolf sneered, "but ultimately meaningless. You're dying in the rain for nothing. We'll find her, we'll use her, and everything you did here will be erased like it never happened." Pablo closed his eyes, feeling the rain wash over him. In the distance, he could hear sirens, police, probably called by some concerned citizen who'd heard gunshots. Too far away to save him, but close enough that Dante would have to make a choice. Stay and finish this, or retreat before law enforcement arrived. "Kill him," Dante said, standing. "Make it clean. We need to move before." "No," Wolf interrupted. "Let him bleed out. Let him lie here knowing he failed. That's worse than a bullet." Footsteps receding, car doors slamming, engines roaring to life. They were leaving him to die slowly, alone in the rain. It was meant to be cruelty, but Pablo found it was actually mercy. Time to think. Time to hope that Snow had run far enough, fast enough. The rain fell harder, washing blood from the pavement, diluting the evidence of violence into the city's gutters. Pablo lay still, feeling his life leak away in rhythmic pulses. His vision was fading again, the gray sky turning white, then translucent. He thought about Snow's drawings, about stick figures holding hands, about cherry blossoms and guardian serpents and the possibility of redemption. He thought about Tijan, rotting in a cell for a crime Pablo had authored. About Mi-sun, dying in a hospital bed from the stress of supporting a family broken by Pablo's casual cruelty. About all the lives he'd destroyed with the same cold efficiency he'd used to destroy rival gangs. But he also thought about Snow's hand in his, about her choosing to stay when she could have run, about a 6-year-old girl teaching a killer what loyalty meant when it couldn't be bought or coerced. The sirens were closer now, maybe 5 minutes away, maybe less. Pablo's lips moved, forming words the rain immediately washed away. I planted the seed. I found the garden. I kept one flower safe. It wasn't redemption, wasn't forgiveness. One good act couldn't erase 3 decades of evil, but it was something. A final choice to be different, to be the guardian instead of the monster, even if only once, even if only at the very end. His vision was going dark for real now, not the temporary blackness of unconsciousness, but the permanent dark of a system shutting down. Pablo didn't fight it. He'd done what he came to do. Snow was out there somewhere, running through rain toward a future he'd bought with the only currency he had left. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was rain falling from a gray sky, drops like tears, washing everything clean. Snow ran through the rain until her legs burned and her lungs felt like torn paper. She ran past the 24-hour convenience store where the owner sometimes gave her expired bread, past the playground with the broken swings where she used to watch other children play, past the subway entrance where her mother caught the train to her night shift at the hospital. She ran until the familiar streets of her neighborhood dissolved into unfamiliar territory, until the buildings looked different, and the faces of people hurrying through the rain belonged to strangers. Only then did she allow herself to stop, collapsing against the wall of a shuttered storefront, her small body heaving with exhaustion and terror and the weight of everything she'd witnessed. The tactical jacket Pablo had given her was soaked through, heavy as armor. Beneath it, her yellow dress was plastered to her skin, the bright fabric turned dark with water and grime from the tunnel. She stayed there until the rain lessened to drizzle, until her breathing steadied, until the immediate panic faded enough for thought to return. Then she began walking again, more slowly now, with purpose instead of blind flight. She knew where she needed to go. The hospital rose like a concrete fortress against the early morning sky, its windows glowing with the harsh fluorescent light of a place where time held no meaning, where 3 a.m. and 3 p.m. were identical in their sterile urgency. Snow had visited this building dozens of times, knew which entrance the guards ignored, which corridors led to the long-term care ward where her mother lay suspended between treatment and surrender. She slipped inside through the loading dock, moving with the practiced invisibility of a child who'd learned that being noticed meant being questioned, and questions meant authorities, and authorities meant foster care and separation. The elevator carried her to the 7th floor, its walls plastered with health warnings and visiting hour restrictions she ignored. Room 717 was dark except for the glow of monitoring equipment. Mi-sun lay motionless in the adjustable bed, oxygen tubes running beneath her nose, IV lines trailing from her arms like the strings of a broken marionette. She looked smaller than Snow remembered, as if the illness was slowly erasing her, reducing her to outline and shadow. Snow climbed into the chair beside the bed, pulled her knees to her chest, and finally allowed herself to cry. Not the controlled tears she'd shed in the apartment or the tunnel, but deep, racking sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for her father in his cell, for her mother in this hospital prison, for Pablo bleeding in the rain, for herself and the childhood that had been stolen before she'd fully understood what childhood was supposed to be. "Baby," her mother's voice was barely a whisper, rough with medication and exhaustion. "Is that you? What are you doing here so early?" Snow couldn't speak. Couldn't find words that would make sense of the last 12 hours. Instead, she climbed onto the bed, careful of the tubes and wires, and pressed herself against her mother's side like she used to when she was smaller, when the world's cruelties still felt temporary and survivable. Mi-sun's thin arm wrapped around her daughter, holding her with what little strength remained. "You're soaking wet, and you smell like... Snow, where have you been?" "There was a man," Snow finally managed. "He was hurt. I helped him. But there were other men, bad men, and we had to run. He made me leave him. He made me run away, and I don't know if he's..." She couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't know how to articulate the terrible certainty that Pablo had sacrificed himself so she could escape, that he'd chosen to be the guardian serpent from his own story, planting the last seed even though it meant his destruction. Mi-sun was fully awake now, her medical training overriding her illness, her hands checking Snow for injuries with professional efficiency. "Are you hurt? Did anyone touch you? Snow, baby, I need you to tell me everything." But before Snow could answer, the room's phone rang, a harsh electronic shriek that made them both jump. Mi-sun answered it, her face going pale as she listened to whoever was on the other end. She hung up without speaking, her hands trembling. "The police are here," she whispered. "They want to talk to you. They say there was a shooting near our building. They found a man in the rain. He's..." She paused, seemed to force herself to continue. "He's in surgery now, critical condition. He won't give them his name, won't say anything except that a little girl named Snow is safe." The words hit like electricity. Pablo was alive. Barely, maybe not for long, but alive. 2 weeks passed like a fever dream. Police interviews conducted gently by detectives who seemed to understand that Snow was a victim, not a witness to be pressed. Social workers who made temporary arrangements, placed Snow with a foster family while they sorted things out. Mi-sun's mysterious medical bills suddenly paid in full by an anonymous donor. Her father transferred to a minimum security facility with a notation in his file recommending early parole review. Snow said nothing about Tejan's connection to Pablo, nothing about the letters or the suicide mission or the weight of sins passed between generations. Some secrets were meant to be kept, some debts too complex for official records. The foster family was kind, an older couple whose own children had grown and moved away. They gave Snow her own room, small but clean, with a window that looked out on a garden instead of a crumbling courtyard. They asked few questions, seemed to understand that she needed space to process trauma they couldn't fully comprehend. On her first night in the new room, Snow unpacked the few belongings she'd managed to salvage from the apartment. Her tackle box of medical supplies, 3 crayons, and Pablo's blood-stained suit jacket that she'd refused to surrender despite the social worker's gentle insistence that it should be cleaned or disposed of. She hung the jacket in her small closet where she could see it, then turned to the blank wall beside her bed. For hours she worked with her crayons, drawing with the intense focus she'd once applied to healing Pablo's wounds with stickers and band-aids. The drawing started simple, a stick figure in a yellow dress. Then she added another figure beside it, much larger, covered in elaborate patterns meant to represent tattoos. She gave this figure a suit jacket, shaded it carefully in dark colors. Around the 2 figures she drew a circle, then another, protective rings like the walls of a fortress. But the central image, the one she labored over until her hands cramped, was the serpent. She drew it coiled around both figures, its body forming a barrier between them and the dark shapes she sketched in the margins, the monsters, the bad men, the dragons from Pablo's stories. The serpent's eyes were open, alert, protective, and sprouting from its scales she drew small flowers, cherry blossoms, rendered in pink crayon, their petals falling like hope made visible. At the bottom of the drawing, she wrote in careful block letters, "The guardian serpent and the last seed." 3 months later, on a morning when spring was finally pushing through winter's last resistance, Snow's foster mother called her to the kitchen. There was a package on the table, wrapped in plain brown paper, addressed to Snow in handwriting she didn't recognize. Inside she found a children's book, professionally bound, the cover illustrated with a serpent coiled around a garden. The title read, "The Guardian's Last Seed." No author was listed, just a small notation on the copyright page, for the girl who taught a monster to plant flowers. Snow opened to the first page and found her story, their story, transformed into the fairy tale Pablo had told her. The serpent who had burned gardens learning to protect them instead. The night's final lesson about fighting only for things worth protecting. The last seed planted in soil watered with sacrifice. The final page showed a small girl standing in a garden of cherry blossoms, safe and whole, while in the shadows at the edge of the illustration, barely visible, a serpent watched over her. The text read simply, "And the guardian kept his promise even when it cost him everything." Because that's what love means, choosing to protect what's precious, even if you'll never see it bloom. Tucked between the pages was a card, unsigned, bearing only a few lines in the same unfamiliar handwriting. "Your father's case is being reviewed. New evidence has emerged. Your mother's treatments are covered through a medical fund established in your name. Neither was ever your burden to carry. Sometimes old monsters can dismantle the systems they built, even from hospital beds. The serpent is still watching." Snow held the card for a long moment, then placed it carefully back in the book. She didn't know if Pablo had survived his wounds, if he was truly watching from some shadow, or if this was the work of someone else trying to honor a debt they didn't owe. It didn't matter. The choice he'd made in that tunnel, the stand he'd taken in the rain, those were real. Those had changed the trajectory of her life irrevocably. That night, Snow added to her wall drawing. She drew a new element beside the serpent and the girl, a small plant just beginning to sprout, its first leaves unfurling toward light she colored in bright yellow. The last seed, finally finding purchase, finally growing in the garden the guardian had died to protect. Above it, in careful letters, she wrote a new caption. "MONSDRS can choose to be different." She stepped back to examine her work, this visual record of the most terrifying and transformative night of her young life. In her mind, she heard Pablo's voice telling stories about brave serpents and healing flowers, about promises written in ink on skin so they'd never be forgotten. And somewhere in the distance, real or imagined, Snow could have sworn she heard the sound of a wounded man breathing steadily in the darkness, keeping watch over gardens he would never enter, protecting flowers he would never see bloom. The guardian had kept his promise. The secret was safe. And in a small room with a window overlooking an actual garden, a little girl named Snow fell asleep holding a book about redemption, wrapped in the blood-stained jacket of a monster who'd chosen, at the very end, to be something different.